for a special broadcast.
This is an MSNBC Living History event, June 6, 1944, as it happened. Here again, Lester Holt.
And we're back now. It's 8:55 p.m. Eastern Wartime, 3:55 a.m. in Normandy, where the Allies have landed and struck inland towards the liberation of France and the defeat of Germany. Almost all of France remains under the grip of the Third Reich. NBC's Tom Aspel has this report from Nazi-occupied Paris.
This is Tom Aspel in German-occupied Paris. The first sign something dramatic was underway came this morning when German-controlled French radio came on the air late at 9 a.m. instead of the usual 6:45. The broadcast began with a brief announcement that Allied paratroopers were on the ground in France.
The Vichy government has been scrambling all day to control the story. At 2 this afternoon, Marshal Pétain, the president of the German-controlled Vichy government, addressed the citizens of France. He went on the radio to warn the people not to aggravate the tense situation or there would be tragic reprisals. The French Office of Information issued an order to newspapers not to publish the word invasion and instead to call it an attempt at a British-American landing. It was 4 years ago this month that disillusioned Parisians watched the German show of strength along the Champs-Élysées as the French government caved in quickly to the Nazi dictatorship. Every day since then, Parisians see thousands of Nazi uniforms throughout their city, a painful reminder of French capitulation to this regime. The emotional high point of the day came at 5:45, when General Charles de Gaulle, the leader of the Free French, now in London with the Allies, went to the BBC to make this broadcast, starting with the words, "The supreme battle has begun."
La bataille suprême est engagée. Après tant de combats, de fureur, de douleur, voici venu le choc décisif. Bien entendu, c'est la bataille de France et c'est la bataille de la France.
There is talk tonight that members of the French resistance, alerted to this invasion by Allied intelligence, may have begun cutting telephone lines all across France, interrupting communications between German high command and the coast in Normandy. Parisians we've talked to today are elated at the news of the Allied invasion, but cautious in their enthusiasm. There is fear the Germans may retaliate by bombing French coastal villages. They are optimistic that the time for liberation will come, but until then, many here feel things will get worse before they get better. Tom Aspel, NBC News in German-occupied Paris.
Our latest reports are that the Allies have moved off of some of those 5 beaches we've been telling you about, that they've already seized control of one town, a village called Saint-Marie-Glis. We were able to get that report earlier this evening from embedded reporter Donna Friesen from that village, but since have lost contact with her. Now that the second front has been opened, what about the Eastern Front, where our Russian allies have been locked in their own bloody war with the Germans? NBC's Preston Mendenhall joins me now from Moscow. Preston, the Russian army has been fighting the Germans along the Eastern Front for 3 years now. What's the mood in Moscow tonight?
Lester, as word filters out here in Moscow of the Allied invasion, there is jubilation and dancing in the streets. We have not yet heard an official reaction from Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, but one can imagine that from inside the walls of the Kremlin here behind me, there is also a sense of jubilation and indeed relief. And that is because the Soviets have been pressing the British and the Americans for several years now to open up this second front, as happened today. In fact, in the spring of 1942, Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov received assurances from British Prime Minister Winston Churchill that the invasion would take place that year. Of course, it did not. And then the next year, another promise from the Allies that the invasion would take place. It did not happen either. President Roosevelt said that those invasions back at that time would have been impossible, too high a risk to the Allied troops, which lacked munitions and landing craft to get the job done. And Lester, President Roosevelt said that casualties would have been far too high.
And Preston, what was Marshal Stalin's reaction when President Roosevelt would say that the Allies simply weren't ready?
Well, Lester, Stalin apparently didn't buy it at all. He had been trying to convince the American and British leaders over the last couple of years that the German troops, the majority of them, were up at the Soviet front, engaged deeply in battle with Soviet troops, therefore leaving the western flank, the western front, open for an Allied invasion as many as 2 years ago. And Stalin said that his forces had depleted the German army in big battles in Stalingrad and in Kursk, and that the Allied invasion could have continued well before today.
Preston, fair to say that the Soviets remain skeptical of the Americans?
Yes, Lester, there is a great deal of skepticism. The Soviets believe that the U.S. would rather see a depleted Soviet military, that the battles between the Soviets and Hitler's army would drag on and leave both sides very weakened and allow the United States to hold military supremacy in Europe.
But hasn't the U.S. been helping Russia with war supplies?
That's right, Lester. The U.S. Lend-Lease Agreement has supplied the Soviets with billions of dollars of U.S. aid. That's everything from food to hundreds of thousands of motor vehicles for the armed forces, everything from steel and raw materials to keep the factories running here and churning out weapons of war. Now, there have also been miles and miles of telephone cable for communications and plenty of warships. In fact, in the last month and a half, there was the most recent transfer of the USS Milwaukee, a light cruiser that the Americans gave to the Soviets for use in battle. Now, the Soviets do say they are deeply appreciative of this desperately needed aid, but at the same time, they say what was really needed over the last couple of years was the second front to be opened, so there was some of the pressure taken off the Soviet forces who are battling Hitler's army.
And Preston, we've been hearing today, as you know, that to launch the Allied invasion, the decision was actually made a few months ago. Stalin was a part of it. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, Lester, the decision on when to launch the invasion was taken, in fact, several months ago in December at the Allied Summit Conference in Tehran, the capital of Iran. President Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Churchill, and Stalin were there gathered together. Now, we understand that Stalin was asking for specifics on when the invasion would take place and, in fact, who would lead that invasion. Well, he didn't get his answer there in Iran, but several weeks later, he did receive news from President Roosevelt that General Eisenhower would be the supreme commander of the invasion, of the Allied invasion, and that it would take place in the spring of this year.
So where does this leave the Russians right now? What might they be planning?
Well, again, they're obviously relieved that the invasion has begun, but the Soviets are still engaged in their own very fierce battle against German forces. Now, millions of Soviets have died and been killed since the war began. In some cases, they've managed to push back Hitler's forces and force the Nazis into retreat. But still, there's a feeling here that the survival of the country is still very much at stake. Now, we do understand that the Soviets right now are amassing some 2 million troops near Lithuania and Belarus in an attempt to punch through Hitler's forces there and drive a corridor into Europe. And many here believe that if they are able to get through Hitler's forces there, they would be able to march through and on to victory in Berlin. But for today, just hours after the Allied invasion has begun, there is a sense of here in the Soviet Union of elation, and that perhaps some of the pressure has been taken off of the Soviet forces also battling Hitler's troops. Lester?
Well, clearly a new day in the war for the Russians. NBC's Preston Mendenhall in Moscow for us. Preston, thank you. Coming up next, NBC military analyst, retired Army General Barry McCaffrey on the battle and the battlefront. We'll take a closer look at the Allies' battle plan and the road ahead for Allied forces as they battle the Germans in France and beyond when we return.
You've heard a report from NBC in Washington.
You're watching an MSNBC Living History event, June 6, 1944, as it happened.